Thank you, Professor Liz, and thank you all, administration. So I have a confession to make. Can you hear me? Okay, good. I have a confession to make. In late May, or perhaps it was early June, when President Bettison Varga asked me to give the Convocation talk, I, typical, said sure. I was feeling good. I'd recently been honored with an endowed chair and excited about getting back to wrapping up my project, my research project on African American letters in the Civil War era. How hard could it be, I thought, to give a 10-minute talk in September? So I wrote the talk out in my mind, imagining welcoming new and returning students and giving an uplifting message about taking advantage of your college years. I plan to encourage you to enroll in challenging courses offered in the humanities, social, and natural sciences, to attend lectures, dance and music performances, and art exhibitions in order to become more fully informed participants in our national and global society. I plan to expand on this idea, I had a 10-minute talk after all, to encourage you to explore your own creativity and that of others. Interacting with the arts is part and parcel of developing the intellect, I would expand on, enabling you to think more imaginatively and perhaps enabling you to transcend conventional solutions to old and new problems in ways never before considered or experienced. Then, having inspired at least some of you, I hoped, I would make everyone feel good by leaving early. This was the talk I planned to give in June. But then reality set in, and it hit me like a ton of bricks. I felt a huge weight on my entire body as I read letters written in 1865 and read current sensational news events related to African Americans in 2015. The deaths of Freddie Gray, Sandra Bland, the 9 worshipers at Charleston's African Methodist Episcopal Church, and so many others haunted me. Reading 19th century letters and current events was not just overwhelming, but in particular ways it was strangely similar. Like the spring and summer of 1865, too many African Americans are being brutalized and are killed in this new century. Human rights and civil rights remain elusive. So I knew I couldn't just give the talk that I had imagined, but not yet written. I needed to honor those who lived 150 years ago. I needed to talk about those Americans who expected great possibilities and freedom. And I needed for myself to make sense of what was happening then to help me to understand what's happening in the 21st century. African American life is still in such jeopardy, still so vulnerable a century and a half later, that the slogan, Black Lives Matter, resonates. The war cry today that African American life is as precious as the lives of all other Americans was questioned in 1865. In fact, the nation was absorbed, if not obsessed, with the meaning of Black freedom. In the spring and summer of 1865, newly freed men, women, and children answered the question without hesitation. Freedom meant being in family. While enslaved people referred to wives and husbands and considered themselves married, the legal reality was that as property, Black people were kinless. Families were constantly torn apart because of sale, forced migration, slaveholders' deaths, indebtedness, inheritance, or punishment. So rather than be concerned about how the country was going to get reunited, former slaves set about searching for family members during and after the Civil War, long after the Civil War, into the 20th century. When freed woman Delia was asked to stay on the plantation in which she had been enslaved, she replied, "No, master, if I'm really free, I must go and find my husband." But finding family and uniting were two different things in 1865 and long after. Beginning with the imminence of abolition in Maryland, for example, former slaveholders established what they called apprenticeships. that enabled them legally to maintain control over black children and their labor without parental consent. This practice spread all over the South, and even after the Supreme Court declared these laws unconstitutional. Freedwoman Lucy Lee wrote, "We were delighted when we heard that the Constitution set us free. But God help us. Our condition is bettered but little, free ourselves but deprived of our children." Freed people also viewed freedom as the ability to live decently without white interference, to benefit from their own labor, to gain an education, to establish their own churches and other social organizations, and have political rights that protected their freedom. Black political mobilization was so fast that it shocked federal officials. Their agitation, along with that of their white allies and the political interest of the Republican Party, led to the passage within a few years of two critical amendments, the 14th and 15th Amendments. Now, the latter particularly is in jeopardy. But the 14th is being discussed, as we all know too well. Do we know what the 14th and 15th Amendment is? Yeah, the 14th Amendment grants the immediate citizenship to all children born in this country, and the 15th Amendment gave black men the right to vote. So in other words, black people understood freedom as the ability to experience the same freedom as whites. Like former slaves, most Southern whites in the spring and summer of 1865 answered the question of the meaning of freedom without hesitation. But to these Southern whites, black freedom would be in name only. Blacks of all ages, former enslaved men, women, and children, and those who had been free for some time were subjected to beatings, rapes, shootings, and, yes, mass murders if they tried to express their understanding of freedom. According to a white officer of a black regiment based in Louisiana, when Confederate soldiers returned to their homes in that spring, they began resuming their old positions all over the country, taking out their fury about the outcome of the war on black people, especially targeting black Union Army soldiers and their wives. But it seems any black person would do. A president of a Missouri college notified federal authorities that, quote, a reign of terror existed in rural Missouri. The fact is, a reign of terror existed throughout the South in 1865 and long after. We have to ask ourselves when it ended. African Americans fought back. They armed themselves, contacted federal officials, courageously testified in congressional hearings, and many tried to leave. Only a few successfully got out of the South that year. White Southerners consistently brutalized those who expressed their most basic understanding of freedom, to be a family. Kentuckian Jane Coward, whose husband was still in the Army, warns him in a letter in early July that her former slave owner said he would kill him if he tried to come for her and their children. She explains that the ex-slaveholder and another man forced her and the children back on the plantation. She writes, quote, R.L. Moore and Mr. Frank Coward came here today and beat me nearly to death. After the beating, Mr. Moore told me that he will kill every woman that he knows that has got a husband in the Army. He said that I think that I am as good as he is. In early September, Sergeant Joe Brown reported to federal authorities that he was sitting at the door of his home when his neighbor, a Memphis policeman, shouted across the street that, quote, I wish I could get a chance to kill all the damn soldiers. I said, you can't kill me. He then stepped back a few paces and ran up and struck me on the head with his club. At that time, another policeman came up and struck me several times, and they threw me down and stabbed me in the back while lying on the ground. Sergeant Brown actually was lucky that the police assault occurred in a city where federal authorities still remained. In fact, both Jane Coward and Sergeant Brown's experiences could have been much worse, as evidenced by the savage acts many blacks encountered. I'm sparing us all, including myself, of reciting them. Aware of the outrages of former slaves were experiencing, the editor of a black California newspaper captured the feelings of many, if not most, African Americans in this period when he editorialized, the war does not appear to us to be ended nor suppressed. So my question, just trying to make sense of this, is if African Americans generally believed that the war wasn't over in 1865, then when, to their minds, did it end? What was the criterion they used that signaled an end to war? Was that spring and summer the beginning of a new phase of a kind of war that had begun centuries before? Did war continue because they dared think they were, quote, as good as whites? After reading multiple letters and thinking about specific events African Americans experience today, I concluded that Black people in the United States understood the cause of war and when it ended quite differently from most white Americans and perhaps even many scholars. Yes, of course, they know and we know that the war was about slavery. We need only read Confederate documents from 1860 to 1865 to learn that the South went to war to protect slavery. Black labor and value were the means of slaveholders' wealth and prestige, and also that of those indirectly connected to the brutal system all over the nation. Yet when we say that slavery was the cause of war and we leave it at that, we ignore, I'm looking over at my colleague who's also a historian, so she knows this stuff really well. And we leave it at that. We ignore the premise upon which slavery existed and are therefore unable to make sense of 1865 and 2015. The Confederacy, however, was quite clear about its reasons for secession and war. Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, makes it plain that the system of slavery was the essential element of white supremacy. Slavery, he said, was the, quote, cornerstone of the new government and rested upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, submission to the superior race, is the natural and normal condition. Thus, while they lost the war for legal ownership of Black human beings, former Confederates fought for and won the war to protect white supremacy. My mentor used to say, Ken Stamp used to say all the time, I'm not so sure the South lost the war. They may have lost the battle, but they won the war. Direct and structural violence was the means of the Confederate success. And why were they so successful? Because the vast majority of whites in the North and the West agreed with the Confederacy. They too believed and supported white supremacy and did so before, during, and after 1865. The belief that white people are inherently superior to non-whites and therefore should rule over them was implicit in the nation's founding documents and had justified colonization before the nation even was founded and would continue to justify imperialism. So to fast forward to today, this is a 10-minute talk after all, is this how we understand why the Voting Rights Act had to be passed and is now in jeopardy? Why education and perhaps housing is more racially segregated now than in 1954? Why a disproportionate number of Black, brown, and indigenous people are poor and disproportionately imprisoned? And how it is that large national and international companies profit from their imprisonment? I could add questions about predatory lending, predatory policing, the brutalization mainly of Black people at the hands of the police, and so on, and so on, and so on. But ultimately, my question is, if white supremacy is alive and well in 2015 and still defines the character of the country, meaning that the war for African Americans continues, I'm hoping that this year you will join me in looking deeper and harder at its manifestations all around us. Pay attention to the kind of language we use. I'm hoping that we can begin to move out of our current racial paradigm and learn to think creatively about how we can get to a place where Black freedom reflects the freedom former slaves imagined in the summer of 1865. Thank you.